The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Case of the Vampire's Curse by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. In the fall of 1883, Holmes and I travelled to Hertfordshire, a few miles north from London. The Very Honourable Lord Lawrence Collingwood, 3rd Baron Collingwood, had sent us an almost luxurious carriage to Baker Street, urging us to appear immediately. Though the financial offer simply did not allow us to negate this mission, Holmes was somewhat worried that we might end up as a walking fair-ground attraction for the nowadays bored gentry, who was on the verge of social insignificance. The following occurrences shall prove him wrong. The Baron, these days 60 years of age himself, was the only grandchild to the legendary Cuthbert Collingwood, who was ennobled by King George III, grandfather of our Queen Victoria, because of his services as a highly decorated and deserving companion of Admiral Horatio Nelson within the British Navy. Since the hereditary title, actually located in Northumberland, did not imply any ownership, the family found their present, still very comfortable, livelihood within their private estates and lands outside of London. As it turns out, Lord Collingwood's eldest of 4 sons and main heir, Paul, recently died in quite mysterious circumstances. Within 2 days, a serious illness had befallen him. Even all the summoned physicians were not able to classify or actually treat it. They could only attempt to control the symptoms, but as this was not enough, Paul died of an unknown disease. He is now buried in the family crypt. The reason why Holmes and I were called was that now also the second oldest son, John, had apparently caught the same illness. Again, the doctors were clueless. While the Baron did not want to leave the health of his son to chance, he suspected some sort of human influence in these occurrences, and since the police could not find any indications of murder, it was our task to get to the bottom of this. Lord Collingwood's butler, Stephen, who was a white-haired man with a little bit of an Eastern European accent, welcomed us at the main entrance and sent the carriage away immediately. "The Baron is waiting for your arrival," he said, taking our luggage and moving forward. "If you would please follow me." We entered the entrance hall, which truly deserved this name. It was a very tall and wide room. You could not see the end of it. Noble pomp and a certain inclination to lavishness characterized the entrance and its centered marble stairway, which was decorated with a bust of the general, portraits of the 2 first barons and their wives, and Chinese vases which did not match the rest of the decor at all. Still, a certain aristocratic flair was clear to us. Stephen escorted us to the first floor, through a small corridor, until he stopped in front of a tall door. "The Baron will see you at the library," he explained, and opened the door without entering himself. "My lord, the detectives from London have arrived." "Show them in," a deep voice answered. The butler gesticulated his right hand and lowered his head as a sign for us to enter. We met his request and took 2 or 3 steps inside the room, while the door was being closed behind us. The library was a big and tall hall, full of shelves that were filled with books and reached from the bottom to the ceiling. Some of these books you could only get to with movable ladders. Inside the library it was oddly dark, in fact so dark that I could not imagine that one would actually read in here. The Baron, a stately man with a slightly receding hairline, had risen from a large wing chair holding a glass of red wine in his hand. "Welcome to my modest estate," he said with demonstrative restraint. "Thank you," Holmes replied. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson." I bowed my head in the direction of the Baron, accompanied by a strict "My lord." Holmes did not bother very much with aristocratic platitudes, was just waiting, visibly impatiently, until we were offered 2 seats on a long sofa. As we sat down, Holmes, already rejected, offered drinks for both of us. "Very friendly," he said, "but let us get down to business. After all, time is gold, especially in the situation that we are in." "Regrettably, that is correct," Lord Collingwood replied with a sigh. "Well, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, as you already know, my eldest son, Paul, died of an unknown, rapidly advancing disease, which is unknown to our doctors. It was a harsh blow for me and Lady Collingwood when we had to lay him to eternal rest in the family vaults." I assured the Baron our condolences, but Holmes was already alert. "In the family vault?" he repeated. "Yes, of course," Mr. Collingwood confirmed. "There is a crypt below the estate where we bury our relatives. One of the marble coffins down there, though, is empty and has only symbolic meaning." "In what way?" Holmes asked immediately. "You must know," said the Baron, "Paul's surprising death is not the first stroke of fate that has befallen us. 2 years ago we said goodbye to Richard, our youngest son. He served as an officer to Her Majesty the Queen in a regiment in Calcutta, India. He fell during battles against locals. However, his body was not found. Richard was missing for a year and later pronounced dead. Lady Collingwood was devastated when we had to use an empty casket at the ceremonial farewell." Once again I expressed our condolences to Sir Collingwood, who nodded in acknowledgment. "And now," he continued, "our second eldest son, John, also seems to be doomed to die. I cannot accept that. I also hardly believe that this is a coincidence. Even our servants believe that there is a curse on the family." Holmes frowned. "Why would your servants be prone to such superstition?" "That may be explained by their origin," Sir Collingwood replied. "Our butler, Stephen, and our housekeeper, Mary, brother and sister, by the way, are from Hungary. When the Russian Soldetska, 1849, suppressed the Hungarian uprising violently on behalf of the Austrian Emperor, the two came to England as refugees. We took them in and gave them work." "So that actually means," I interjected, and thought that I made a particularly clever remark at the moment, "that Stephen and Mary's names are originally Istvan and Maria, right?" Holmes, unwilling to acknowledge my contribution to comparative ethnological naming research, shook his head briefly before addressing Sir Collingwood again. "Forgive me, but I have to ask you that question. Is your family to blame for anything that is worth a curse?" The Baron waved his hand dismissively. "No, no," he said firmly. "House Collingwood is proud of counting propriety and morality among its virtues. Naturally, you can't be popular everywhere when you own a lot of land. The bourgeoisie and the peasantry demand social and political rights. However, this conflict of interests has yet to be solved." Unfortunately, I could not control myself again and murmured, "Perhaps by using a Russian Cossack army in England?" Sir Collingwood, though, was gracious enough to ignore my inappropriate remark and continued, "Gentlemen, the situation is grave. 2 of my sons are dead, the third is close to dying, and the fourth is a naive dreamer who is working on his career as a zoologist. House Collingwood, with all its titles and lands, is about to perish. At the very least, I want to know who or what is responsible for this." "We'll find out for sure," Holmes promised calmly. "Let's hope so," the Baron replied. "I will now call Mary. She will see us to John's room." "Is there a specific reason for that?" Holmes asked. "Well, yes," Sir Collingwood replied. "I assume you want to see the patient." Holmes looked serious. "I am a consulting detective," he explained, "not a doctor." As I cleared my throat, Holmes was irritated for only a second and then continued, "Of course, a doctor could take a look at—" Again I cleared my throat, and Holmes turned quickly to me. "Christ, Watson," he said indignantly, "don't you think it is a bit rude to constantly interrupt me? What is the issue?" "My doctor's diploma," I answered dryly. A few minutes later, housekeeper Mary, who was a petite middle-aged woman, escorted us to John Collingwood's bedside. When we entered his bedchamber, Mary crossed herself in the Catholic way. I went straight to the bed to examine the patient. The pitiable young man was clearly in a delirious state. He stared straight ahead, his eyes open and unnaturally clear. He hardly seemed to notice the events around him. His ability to speak was lost long ago. Additionally, a high fever may afflict his heart and circulation. I put my index and middle finger on John's carotid arteries so I could measure his pulse, but before I opened my pocket watch, I felt two strange wounds on the patient's neck, not even 2 inches apart, evenly spaced like 2 puncture holes that were caused by a pretty thick needle. I put John's head back to show Holmes the wound. "Holmes," I said, "look at this. What do you think of it?" Even before Holmes could approach, Mary caught a glimpse of the sick man's neck and instantly froze in shock. Then she crossed herself again, turned around and ran out, shouting, "Vugodlak, Vugodlak!" Holmes glared at me. "Watson, you scared the poor woman to death." "Holmes, you are doing me too much honor," I replied. "This widespread terror is more likely the merit of the Vugodlak, an Eastern European folk belief, a blood-sucking vampire." Holmes now stepped up to the bed and inspected the neck with the 2 marks. "And this?" he asked. "Is this the work of a vampire too?" I took a deep breath. "Holmes, in case you want to know if these could be imprints of fangs, there is a possibility. If you want to pin me down concerning the perpetration of a certain undead from a sinister corner of the Pannonian lowland, well then—" "Not at all," interrupted Holmes right away. "Naturally, we could also consult your equally esteemed curious colleague Dr. Van Helsing from Amsterdam, but I would prefer more of a scientific approach." "I am pleased to know that we are on the same page," I replied. "However, we still have to examine the corpse of Lord Collingwood's firstborn for similar stigmata." Holmes nodded approvingly. "The Baron won't be very enthusiastic about us disturbing his son's eternal rest." At that moment, Stephen appeared directly behind us at the door. "Gentlemen," he said abruptly, "dinner is served. The Baron and the Baroness are asking for your company at the table." After we also met Lady Collingwood, about 10 years younger than her husband, but still looking careworn. We sat down at a big table in the dining room of the estate. Mary, who was also cooking, obviously regained her composure, but still as a precaution intended for the first dish to be garlic soup. While Holmes and I exchanged knowing looks, the Collingwoods seemed clueless of the deeper meaning of her culinary choice. "Well, Dr. Watson, what is your impression of my son's medical condition?" asked Sir Collingwood, starting the table conversation. "To my own regret, I have to associate with my fellow colleagues," I replied. "If this is in fact a disease, I am not able to diagnose yet. In order to make a diagnosis, there are also further tests and examinations required. However, I can't guarantee any results." Sir Collingwood declined. "There is no need for that," he replied. "In my opinion, we are not dealing with a natural cause for his illness, but certainly also not an unnatural, unlike what our attendants think." "You have been informed of the stigmata?" I asked. "In a way," confirmed the Baron. Mary thinks that she saw a bite mark on our son's neck and is now under the superstition that a revenant, to be precise, a vampire, is involved in all this." Holmes frowned and interrupted our conversation. "Does your lordship believe in the existence of vampires?" "I am a God-fearing man," Lord Collingwood replied, "and if there is a heaven, there must be a hell as well. Certainly one can imagine that all kinds of abysmal creatures live there and are up to all sorts of mischief. Nevertheless, in my experience, evil on this earth mostly occurs in human form." Holmes nodded. "The abyss of the humankind is the deepest, and their atrocities know no boundaries." "Indeed," the Baron replied, "and that is why I think this crime was committed by a terrestrial power. It is up to you to do the work that you are so well known for, and hunt down the culprit." "We are aware of this responsibility," I interjected. "If we assume this was an attack on your son's lives, the next explanation would be poisoning. The most common substances in this regard, though, were probably already excluded by the doctors, right?" Sir Collingwood confirmed my guess with a nod. "Something we can also exclude," said Holmes suddenly, "is fugu poisoning." "Fugu?" the Baron repeated. "The Japanese puffer," Holmes explained. "A remarkable creature with deadly secretions in its body." "Well, I hope that this fugu is a rare occurrence in this country," Sir Collingwood guessed. Holmes smiled. "Not as rare as you might think. Just recently we had to go to the Japanese consulate in London." I felt compelled to take over the conversation and cut Holmes off. "Excuse me, but why don't we focus on the current case? Back to the stigmata. Even if they are not from a vampire bite, they could be related to the situation. If this is the case, your eldest son would also show these marks. I'm afraid we would have to investigate, if you like it or not." I interrupted myself with consideration for Lady Collingwood, who was still sitting at the table without taking place in the conversation. Fortunately, the Baron already understood what I was trying to say anyways. "Do what you have to do," he said firmly. "Hereby you have all the permission." I thanked him with a nod, and for some time the conversation ran silent. Mary, now wearing a large cross necklace, served the main course. Tender lamb that was supposed to have been cooked with a peppermint sauce was also heavily seasoned with garlic. The Baron, Holmes, and I took it in good spirit. Lady Collingwood remained blank. Finally, Holmes resumed the conversation. "My lord, you mentioned that another son of yours is a zoologist. Is there anything you can tell us about him?" The Baron, seemingly not amused, replied, "There is not much to say. George is something like a zookeeper. He works at the reptile house in the London Zoo, an absolutely unworthy and inappropriate activity." "Well, he actually completed academic studies in biology and zoology," I replied. "That's a little more than just a zookeeper. He is a scientist." Sir Collingwood made a derogatory gesture. "Nonsense," he shouted. "He looks after this absurdly huge giant turtle that this blasphemous charlatan Charles Darwin brought, may he stew in hell, brought from the Galapagos Islands. She even bears his name. George, really. Turtles, snakes, iguanas. That is nothing for a Collingwood." At this point, Lady Collingwood took the floor for the first time. "My dear Lawrence, you must not forget that George, as the third-born, has no prospect of inheriting neither title nor lands. That is the only reason he has taken a different path." Holmes nodded. "But that fact seems to be changing. Paul is dead and John is seriously ill. His recovery is highly doubted. This puts George in the line of succession." Lady Collingwood looked sharply at Holmes. Mr. Holmes, you will not insinuate that he has a motive?" "By no means, and certainly not," I interjected before Holmes could answer. "Please forgive if you gained that impression." Lady Collingwood accepted the apology with a nod. "Imagine what situation we ended up with. George may be our only son that we have left, unless—" At this point, she abruptly stopped talking and turned her face away, and then stared to the portraits on the wall of her 4 sons. "Lady Collingwood is hoping for a miracle," the Baron said. "She is dreaming of the unscathed return of our youngest, her favourite, Richard. He just had to fight a jungle war amongst the common infantry. Truly, an undertaking with not much better promise than reptile science." He turned to his wife. "I am sorry, darling. Richard is dead and will not come back. At least not in one piece." Without directly responding to her husband, Lady Collingwood got up and addressed Holmes and me. "Gentlemen, you allow me to retire prematurely. I lost my appetite." As we bowed down in embarrassment, she left the room. "You must excuse my wife," the Baron said imperturbably. "She's a little sensitive about Richard's regrettable fate." "How about you, sir?" I asked. "I am not heartless," Collingwood replied, "but I'll face the facts. Richard was a sickly and snivelling child. It is a miracle that he made it into the army. Well, he only made it to the foot troops, classic cannon fodder. A true Collingwood, of course, does his military service in the Navy, like Paul and John." Such arrogance challenged Holmes, and he said, "Does that mean that Richard and George are not worthy Collingwoods?" "The Lord," Sir Collingwood said, glancing at the big chandelier above the table, "distributes the blood of the parents unequally to the children. No doubt Richard and George are more likely to take more after their mother." "I understand," replied Holmes, "whereas Paul and John willingly followed in your footsteps." Sir Collingwood nodded. "At least he understands the necessity to uphold the family's heritage. What will happen to the Collingwood family when I lose Paul and John is written in the stars." He obviously did not dare to tell the unpleasant truth, so I did it for him. "Well then, George would have to take their place, right?" The Baron answered in a resigned voice, "God forbid. George is a supporter of the blasphemous lie of evolution, an agnostic and radical democratic liberal. If I understand him correctly, then he even supports women's suffrage. The Collingwoods would be the laughing-stock of England." Even Holmes, who was very apolitical, was aware that these views were absolutely ridiculous. However, he did not show it. "Very well," said Holmes. "Then we will try to contain the damage done and avert any further damage. Dr. Watson and I would be ready to see the family crypt now." Sir Collingwood's expression once again showed slight optimism. "Very well," he said. "I'll show you the way. However, you must understand that I will refrain from accompanying you to the tomb." A few minutes later, armed with a torch and my doctor's bag, Holmes and I went down the stone spiral staircase to the family tomb. We entered the basement vault, which was moderately lit by another torch that was mounted on the wall. All around were several coffins containing the remains of the Collingwood family. Quickly, Holmes identified the right sarcophagus. "Here it is, Watson. This is Paul Collingwood's coffin." He put our torch in a wall mount and tried to move the coffin lid in vain. "Come, Watson, I need help." I hesitated. Holmes became impatient. "What is it again?" he asked. I did not move an inch. "Holmes, can we be absolutely sure that there is no blood-sucking undead under the coffin lid?" Holmes continued. "Yes, we can." "But what if—" I stammered, somewhat disturbed by the surroundings. "Do not worry," Holmes explained. "Then you'll be in the spotlight at least." I looked at Holmes uncomprehendingly. "Why?" I reaped a gloomy smile. "Well then, my good Watson, everyone will know you as the man who bravely and sacrificially opposed a vampire and willingly gave his life to enable the great detective Sherlock Holmes to flee." "Thanks," I answered fatefully, approaching the head of the casket. "Gladly," said Holmes, who grabbed the stone lid at the foot. "May I politely ask you for your cooperation? On 3. When Holmes counted down, we pushed the lid from the casket, which was easier than we thought. For a short second, I was elated that the coffin was not empty, until Holmes said, "Remarkable. The corpse remained almost completely intact. It looks like Paul died yesterday. Watson, am I right in the assumption that this is indicating that we are indeed dealing with vampires?" I looked at him with a serious face. "I am a doctor, Holmes, not a demon hunter. However, I would also assume that a slower decaying process could be useful if the corpse is rising and moving around. However, in this particular case, the cold air down here should ensure the corpse is conserved." "And what about the imprints on the neck?" Holmes asked. Again I hesitated, as I had gathered enough resolution. I grabbed the skull and lifted it so that it could reveal the area that was previously hidden by the chin. There, close to the carotid artery, we saw the identical mark on the dead man's neck as we had seen it on John. "Bite wound or not," I said, "whatever it is, we can find both marks on both necks." Holmes turned away and walked in a circle around the crypt. "That's interesting," he mumbled. "Who does that? And why?" Suddenly we heard footsteps and voices coming down the stairs. Holmes thought for a second, but whispered to me, "Go, hide, in the back of the crypt, fast." So I let go of the corpse's head and leaped behind a casket in the back. Following me was Holmes. While crouching there, we were waiting for the distant voices to approach. Since we could see their silhouettes in the torchlight, we were able to identify the voices. It was Stephen and Mary who came down here. "Stay close to me, Maria," Stephen commanded. "We do not know if the voodoo-lac has already awakened." Both of them approached Paul's casket, and with that stepped further into the light. They had a garlic wreath wrapped around their necks. Mary carried a large crucifix, on it the Messiah's wounded body, and Stephen held a sharpened wooden stake tipped forward in front of his chest. "Look at that," Maria whispered. "The coffin is open. Be careful." Step by step, the butler walked towards the cask until he was able to see Paul laying in it. "Do not worry. He is still in the coffin," Stephen said after sighing in relief. "But the lid is open," Maria replied. "The voodoo-lac could jump out and bite us any time." Thinking for a second, Stephen said, "We have to be quick now. Here, take the stake. You have to position it right above the heart, and I will hit it with the hammer." In our hiding place, I nudged Holmes gently in the ribs to signify that we have to end this unnecessary act of desecration immediately, but he made a soothing gesture. Apparently, he wanted to wait a little longer. Mary also hesitated, her trembling hands clutching the crucifix. "Do I really have to do that?" she asked anxiously. "Would you rather wait until the voodoo lack awakens?" Stephen replied impatiently. Determinedly, Mary shook her head and took the stake with one hand, while she wrapped her fingers around the body of Christ on her crucifix with the other. Obviously, she gathered all her courage, and as she approached the open coffin, then she reached out her hand with the stake in it. "Is that good?" she asked, looking away with her eyes closed. Stephen shook his head. "Open your eyes. You have to look. We want to pierce his heart, not the abdomen." Mary turned her head towards the casket, her eyes still pinched. For a fraction of a second she blinked and actually maneuvered the stake, as far as I could see, over the heart. "It's your turn now," she said, determined. The butler stood next to his sister with a simple mallet in his right hand. "Go on," Mary demanded, but now Stephen hesitated for a moment. But when he finally swung the mallet for the final blow, it was our signal to end this farce. I jumped up behind my hiding spot and shouted, "Halt!" Naturally, I had not considered that the two servants would not recognize us in the dark. "There! Another vukutlak!" exclaimed Mary in horror, pointing, to my surprise, at me, and then hid behind her brother, who did not hesitate for 1 second and hurled the mallet in my direction, hitting me right in the middle of my forehead. With an agonizing cry of pain, I went down to the floor, while Holmes straightened up next to me. "Hold it, we do not want to wake the dead, right?" he said, and took 2 steps towards the two. "It is us, Holmes and Watson. You do recognize us, don't you?" Daringly, Mary stretched out the pointed wooden stake in Holmes's direction. "No further," she commanded, and then turned to her brother. "He might look like Mr. Holmes, but who knows, maybe he has already been bitten." Stephen nodded and asked, "Were you bitten, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. "Oh no, I'm fine." Holmes explained now, completely stepping into the light. He flashed his not very flawless teeth and said, "See? No fangs." Mary lowered her arm that was holding on to the wooden stake. "All right," she said, "but what about Dr. Watson?" A highly appropriate and long overdue question, as I'd think. "He's fine too," Holmes claimed without giving me a look. "He will survive the little bump." "And what were you going to do with Sir Paul?" exclaimed Stephen. "After all, he is a vukudlak." Holmes took the stake from Maria's hand while I straightened up from behind the coffin, suddenly feeling immense pain in my head with the hammer in my hand. "Paul is no more a vukudlak than you or me. There is no vampire here," said Holmes quietly. "Not here, not in Budapest, not in Transylvania, and not in Styria. If poor Paul Collingwood was a vicious bloodsucker, he would have overwhelmed and killed all 4 of us already. And if you, Stephen and Mary, refrain from such superstitious rites from now on, Lord Collingwood will not hear anything from this incident. All right?" Stephen and Mary briefly consulted in Hungarian. As they came to an agreement, the butler said, "All right, but we would like to be safe if you allow us." He then took the crucifix from his sister, went to Paul's coffin and put it on the corpse's torso. "Now, we can close up the coffin again," Stephen said, and took the coffin's lid at the head. Holmes stepped forward and took the opposite end of the lid, and together they closed the grave of Sir Paul Collingwood, so it may now again and truly rest in peace eternally. Then all of us left the family tomb, climbing the winding staircase. After Mary treated my head injury tolerably in the kitchen, and Stephen had apologized 10 times for his precise throw, we went to our room, while the 2 servants went to see John again. Lord Collingwood and his wife had already gone to bed. Holmes and I had been assigned a shared room with 2 beds at the end of a long corridor on the first floor of the left wing of the building. The slightly antique-looking oil lamp that Stephen had provided us with only gave us modest light, in my opinion, but nonetheless led us to our destination. Before Holmes could open the door, I brought up the disturbing and unsatisfactory results of the day. "We have a problem," I stated soberly. Holmes looked at me in amusement. "Only one?" he asked. In fact, a whole series of unresolved problems and questions spread out before us, and from my point of view, there was little reason to hope for an early clarification. As bitter as it was, we would have to consider the possibility that we might fail. "In very few cases we have been able to collect so many interesting facts in such a short time," I continued. "But we have not come closer to solving the case in any way. We do not know anything about John's illness, so we can't do anything about it. We do not know anything about the alleged bite marks on the neck of Paul and John. I wish it was a vampire. Then at least we would know what we ought to do." Holmes looked at the mallet and wooden stake that we had not given back to the Hungarian staff as a precaution, holding it up with a boyish grin. "In case of doubt," he said with a dead serious voice, "we are prepared." I sighed, clearly audible, and opened the door to our room. Inside, it was dark, and only the oil lamp and our reflections created a selective view. When we both entered, Holmes suddenly stopped me. "Wait," he ordered. "We are not alone here." And in fact, there were noises coming from Holmes's bed in the right corner of the room. At first, it sounded like a rustling, as if someone was moving under the blanket. Then we heard a strange and much louder, ominous sound hissing. I held the lamp up a little, and there we could see 2 green eyes with narrow vertical pupils that reflected the light. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I exclaimed, and took a step towards the bed. The next moment, a predatory set of teeth with 2 sharp fangs appeared in front of me. "The vampire!" I stuttered, and backed away as I stumbled and fell over the edge of a carpet backwards to the ground. When the lamp touched the ground, it broke and instantly set fire to that part of the carpet. Simultaneously, the attacker approached, screeching with a great leap towards my position, and drew itself up in front of me with their eyes bright and teeth bared, fiercely ready to bite into my throat. It was just now that I saw that, of course, it was not a vampire, not even human, but a huge snake, whose upper body and broad head staggered in front of my nose. "Don't move," Holmes said calmly. He slowly approached the snake from behind. He readied the hammer as if he was holding a cricket bat in his hand. "Hurry up, Holmes," I whispered. "She'll bite at any moment." And right at the second when the snake was about to bite, Holmes hit it right at the back of the head. The snake sank, motionless to the floor, right between my legs. Immediately I jumped up and headed for the door. "Don't panic," Holmes said. "She is dead." He then stepped over to the bed and took a blanket to stifle the little fire on the carpet. Still stunned, I stammered, "What was that monster?" "Well," said Holmes casually as he successfully fought the flames. "Well, what?" I asked. "Well," Holmes repeated after he had straightened up again and picked up the lamp, which was now in desolate shape, and lit the candles in the room. And in no time the dark room was lit. I took a deep breath. "Listen, Holmes," I explained slowly. "After just barely escaping death, many thanks for your courageous intervention, by the way, My mood only partially correlates with your usual jokes. What exactly do you want to tell me?" Holmes calmly answered. "The now lifeless creature at your feet is the South Asian cobra, scientific name Naja Naja, from Linnaeus, 1758. As I regained my composure, I grabbed the wooden stake that laid on the floor. Along with this, I carefully picked up the snake so that it hung down left and right from me. After a brief examination, especially of the characteristic drawing on the back of the pronotum, I was able to confirm what Holmes had claimed. "In fact," I said, somewhat impressed, "an exceptionally well-grown specimen of the Indian cobra, also known as a spectacled cobra. A deadly but extremely magnificent animal. What a pity that it—" I interrupted myself as I suddenly heard the cobra hissing again, albeit softly. The supposed slain reptile evidently regained consciousness and already stirred at my cane. "Holmes," I exclaimed in horror, "the snake is still alive. Do something." I tried to keep the cobra away from my body as much as possible, but with the stake in one hand and the snake being over 6 feet long, this attempt was in vain. "Holmes," I insisted, "the current time would be the right one." He looked around the room and spotted a Chinese vase on the sink. He then stormed towards it, took it and brought it to me. "Get it in there," he ordered as he opened the porcelain lid just in time. Luckily, I managed to pull the still groggy cobra into the opening of the vase. Holmes closed the lid as soon as the snake was inside it. We then both gasped in relief. After a short thinking pause, Holmes stated, "We will have to consult an expert." In heroic self-restraint, I had already found my sense of humor again, despite me almost breathing my last breath twice today. "All right," I confirmed, "but where do we find an Indian snake charmer now?" Holmes apparently took my comment more seriously than expected. "That is not the problem, Watson," he explained. "Every fair today has a fakir in the program, but that is charlatanism. We need a herpetologist, a reptile researcher, and I am already thinking of a suitable person." While I was not sure what Holmes wanted to discuss with a zoological expert, he had already sat down at the desk and started to write a short letter. I refrained from disturbing him and made sure that the lid of the vase was tightly sealed, especially after I was able to hear another ominous hiss coming from the inside. Holmes put the finished letter in an envelope, closed it and labelled it with the recipient's address. Then he handed me the letter. "Watson, would you be kind enough to visit the butler? Wake him up if necessary. He must ensure that this letter is brought to London immediately tonight. It is about life and death." I took the envelope, and before I would make my way over to Stephen, I replied, "Very well, but I would like to know what exactly you are up to." Holmes nodded. "Of course, my dear Watson. The answers you are seeking will come in time. Right now, though, it is very urgent that you bring this letter to Stephen." I turned around and was almost out of the door when I faced Holmes again and asked, "And what are you going to do in the meantime?" "Well," said Holmes, as always, "unless there are other poisonous animals hidden under the blanket, I intend to go to bed. Therefore, I would be very grateful if you did not cause any noise upon your return. Also, please lock the door. After all, someone has just tried to murder us. Good night." The next morning we got up when we heard the first rooster scream. While Holmes slept like a dead man, it was hardly possible for me to close even one eye. The blood-curdling events of the evening, the cobra roaring around in the vase, and the prospect of further assassinations did not exactly help me with falling asleep. When Holmes jumped out of bed all rested, clapping his hands burning for action, I dragged myself to the table in our room with some difficulty. My miserable state was not hidden to Holmes' sharp eyes. "For God's sake, Watson," he said, "you look awful." "Thank you," I replied as I dropped into a chair. Holmes hesitated, and for a second his gaze wandered over to the sideboard that carried all the spirits. "You did not drink, did you?" With an annoyed and derogatory gesture, I declined. "Excuse me, Holmes," I apologized immediately, "but right now I am lacking a little bit of composure to have such a debate. Death and corruption, infirmity, vampires, exorcisms and curses, an underground tomb and deadly venomous snakes in an aristocratic mansion. That is a little bit much. One might think we were acting out a penny dreadful." "Don't worry," replied Holmes, not only in a happy but also optimistic mood. "I am sure that everything will be clarified today." I looked gravely at Holmes, shaking my head slowly. "If I may assume that this not exactly indigenous spectacle cobra is not eligible as an independent culprit, we are still facing significant problems. 1.5 murders and 2 murder attempts with a cobra as a perfidious murder weapon. How are you going to solve that? Who in the world would do something like that?" Holmes remained unmoved and began to stuff his pipe. "That's the question we have to find an answer to," he said. "Who has the motive, the means, and the opportunity to act that way? That would be our culprit." Before I could reply, there was a knock on the door. Holmes opened, and the butler entered carrying a breakfast tray. "Good morning, gentlemen," Stephen said as he stepped to the table and placed the tray containing our breakfast on the table. Then he spotted the burnt hole in the carpet and shook his head. "That is going to be expensive," he murmured, more to himself, before turning back to us. "Did the gentleman have a good night?" "Within our given circumstances," Holmes replied. "May I assume that our letter was sent to London yesterday?" "Of course," Stephen confirmed. "It was timely dispatched by an overnight courier. You can expect a quick response." "I hope so," Holmes murmured, more to himself as well. "Unfortunately, I must inform you about unpleasant and disturbing events that occurred overnight," said Stephen, now addressing me. "The one thing is that Sir John's health has deteriorated considerably. He might not survive the day." Holmes and I acknowledged this expected message with a nod. "On the other hand," Stephen continued, "the other thing is that the events have affected my sister Maria. Apparently, she has suffered a considerable shock. When she went to see Sir John again last night, she came back absolutely flustered and said that she had seen a ghost. Since then, she has not spoken a word." "A ghost?" Holmes repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, of course, ghost," I exclaimed and clapped my hands. "That is exactly what we are missing in our collection of horrors. Great." Holmes punished me with a harsh look and turned to Stephen. "What Dr. Watson, who is supposed to be a medical doctor by profession, was going to say is that he will go and take care of your sister as soon as possible." I cleared my throat and confirmed this with a short, "Yes." The butler thanked us and left. Holmes sat down at the table, poured himself a cup of tea and lit his pipe. Apparently, he felt like we had all the time in the world. At first, I was surprised. Then I started to stare directly at Holmes, who only responded after 2 long minutes. "What is it, Watson?" he asked reproachfully. Why are you sitting here idly? Don't you have patients to see?" Before I could protest, Holmes added, "Don't forget your doctor's bag. Go ahead, visit Mary first, and in 30 minutes we will meet at the sickbed of Sir John." Half an hour later, when I entered the room of the Collingwood heir, Holmes was already present. He stood in front of the bed with his back to the door, still noticing my arrival. "Well, Watson?" he asked without facing my direction. "How is the housekeeper?" I stopped and waited for Holmes to turn around, but he did not. That is why, whether I liked it or not, I had to speak to his back. "Hard to say," I answered valiantly. "Mary is barely responsive and does not show any reaction to anything, but she is evidently conscious. She is in a state of deep anxiety that was triggered by a traumatic experience. Revoking her current state will take some time. For now she sits in a rocking chair, rocking back and forth continuously while she is clutching the cross on her necklace, occasionally mumbling a few words in Hungarian. However, even her brother does not seem to understand the words fully. The only words that he can make out, and are likely to occur in her mumblings, are spirit, dead, and undead. Nevertheless, from a purely physical point of view, nothing is amiss." "I understand," muttered Holmes, seemingly absent-minded while not taking his eyes off John Collingwood. Since Holmes obviously had no further questions concerning Maria, I started to examine the other patient. So I stepped up to the bed next to Holmes and looked at John. As a matter of fact, his state had deteriorated. He was now in a kind of comatose state, a deep sleep with reduced heart rate and circulatory functions. Waking up from this state was highly improbable. Even brain damage had to be considered in case he still woke up. "He will die," I finally said, looking at Holmes, who abruptly woke from his absence and said, "Certainly, but not today." In the next moment we could hear the low ringing of the doorbell in the ground floor announcing a guest. "Who could that be?" I asked. "Has a priest been appointed?" "Nonsense, Watson," said Holmes. "This is John's salvation." Then he stormed, by his standards, at a rapid pace out of the room and down the hall to the staircase into the ground floor. In the distance I heard him call, "Stephen, send him to John's room right now." Holmes returned with a peculiar expression of satisfaction. "What's going on, Holmes?" I asked. "Just a second," he put me off. "Everything will resolve soon." Only a few seconds later, a young man stood in the doorway, wearing khaki trousers, work boots, and a brown shirt and round glasses on his unknown face. "Hello," he said, putting down his small suitcase on the dresser. "I came as fast as I could. Good that you called me, Mr. Holmes." Holmes then turned to me. I must have given him the impression that I was not able to completely grasp what was going on, and said, "May I introduce Watson? This is Mr. George Collingwood." I interrupted, as I finally remembered the portraits in the dining room of the estate. "Yes, indeed," Holmes confirmed, though he was cheated out on a small surprise effect. Then he turned over to the newcomer. "Did you bring what I asked for?" "Of course," George replied, opening his case and taking out a small vial containing a clear liquid. He gave it to Holmes. Holmes then thanked George, took my medical bag from my hand, and began to rummage in it. When he finally found a new syringe set in it, he looked at me. "Watson, would you please uncover John's left arm and prepare it for an injection?" I did as he had asked, while Holmes filled the syringe with the liquid from George's vial. Then he turned over to the patient and found, probably due to his experience with cocaine infusions, easily the right vein, and administered the still, to me, unknown drug intravenously. "All right," said Holmes, and turned around to face us. While he and George made happy faces, I was a little suspicious. "Gentlemen," I began, "to my knowledge, I am the only doctor in the room. That is why I would like to know what has just happened here." Holmes nodded understanding. "Of course. Last night, when it became clear that Paul's and John's condition had been caused by the bite of the South Asian cobra, I immediately thought of somebody who had experience with reptiles." "As a perpetrator?" I interjected, and gave George a corresponding look. Holmes shook his head. "After careful consideration, I was able to rule that out. George has not been on his family's estate for months, and any prolonged absence would have been noticed at the London Zoo. Not to mention the theft of a spectacled snake. Instead, another important thought occurred to me. Within the reptile house of the zoo, as well as in the terrariums of some insects and arachnids, the staff has to handle all sorts of poisonous creatures, including not only snakes but also scorpions, spiders, and amphibians. Naturally, the one or other accident is bound to happen." "That is right," George confirmed. "Even though we handle these animals with utmost caution, an employee is bitten or stung. And because of that," Holmes continued, "the reptile house works closely with the Institute of Tropical Medicine. There they have a vast collection of antidotes against various toxins and diseases. Just now I have injected Sir John with an anti-serum to the poison of the South Asian cobra. The effect of the snake's venom is now reduced until it is eliminated from the body. This might put some strain on John's organisms, but in general nothing stands in the way of a full recovery." "That is great news," I called. "We must inform Lord and Lady Collingwood immediately." "Calm down," Holmes warned. "We are still dealing with an unidentified murderer and assassin." And of course Holmes was right. The perpetrator was still amongst us and would definitely plan further steps. Of course, we had to anticipate that. After a moment of reflection, Holmes said, "Watson, if you could inform the family and staff about Sir John's upcoming recovery, and then ask everyone to gather in the library in half an hour. Then I'll clear up the case." "Clear up?" I repeated incredulously. Holmes looked at me blankly. "Yes, of course. We are here for that, aren't we?" 40 minutes later, we were waiting in the library for Holmes. The Baron, pleased with John's recovery, but suspicious of George's presence, poured himself a glass of red wine despite the early hours of the day. Lady Collingwood sat motionless in a chair and did not seem to care much for the others. George, with rebellious detachment from the staff, informed Stephen about the latest legal workers' rights. Mary had been brought along with her rocking chair. Her mental state had not improved. I walked up and down in front of the bookshelves, occasionally reading the works on their spine, waiting impatiently for the arrival of Holmes. "Where is our master detective?" Lord Collingwood shouted while he poured another glass. A question I could not answer, because punctuality was by no means part of Holmes's habits. The fact that he had asked for my Webley revolver just before our paths separated in John's room made me feel a little more uneasy. "Mr. Holmes will certainly appear soon and answer our questions," I said. It took another 5 minutes without Holmes having appeared. He was already a quarter of an hour late, which was reasonably unusual. But then the door finally opened. Holmes came in holding my revolver in his hand. However, we would soon see that he was not alone. He brought someone with him, a ghost. Mary cried out and crossed herself 3 times when, like all of us, she recognized the person next to Holmes as the youngest Collingwood son, Richard, believed to be dead. The Baron dropped his wine-glass to the floor. George took off his glasses and squinted. Stephen stammered, "Sir Richard, you live!" Only Lady Collingwood could not be stirred up, and her face stayed blank. "Holmes, are you all right?" I called and walked towards him. "Yes, I am fine," said Holmes. "Forgive my delay, but that was part of my plan. The murderer had to believe that everyone else in the library was gathered, so he could attempt another assassination of Sir John, supposedly undisturbed. In fact, he snuck into John's room and tried to strangle him with a pillow. What he did not know was that I had been waiting for him behind the curtain with the weapon in my hand." "But how is that possible?" I asked. "Here is what happened," began Holmes. "Sir Richard, only number 4 in the line of succession, unloved by his father, faked his apparent death in India. After enough time had passed, he returned to England incognito, carrying a handsome cobra in his luggage to reassess the succession. Paul and John had to die. George would resign anyways. And then all of a sudden the lost prodigal son, exactly as Lady Collingwood hoped, would return and tell of the adventurous tales of how he was lost in the Bengali jungle, or how he was captured by a local rebel group and survived through fortunate circumstances and returned to civilization. After his father's demise, which might also have been helped along a little, he would become the 4th Baron Collingwood." The current 3rd Baron walked up to Holmes and his son and looked at his son in disgust. "Is that true, Richard?" he asked. "Did you kill your own brother, Paul? Did you try to kill John, too?" Suddenly Lady Collingwood jumped up. "Don't answer," she exclaimed. "Do not say a word. They have no evidence." While the amazement was clearly to be read from the Baron's face and gestures, Holmes seemed less surprised. "My lady," he said, "I'm afraid there is clear evidence, even without a confession. In addition, I am certain that the police will find pertinent evidence when they search Richard's secret hideout. I assume that it is located somewhere on the premises, as well as his accomplice's private quarters." I contented myself with my role as a keyword generator and asked, "His accomplice?" "Yes, indeed," said Holmes. "Richard needed financial resources for his time in India, for the return trip, and to go into hiding in England. He needed to know what was going on in the manor and to have access to all the rooms at the right time. He could not have done any of this without help from the inside." The Baron looked sharply at George, who tapped his forehead twice, and Stephen, who vigorously shook his head. Both of them denying any involvement caused Lord Collingwood's gaze to return back to Holmes. And Holmes was ready to resume proceedings. "Your lordship will not like to hear this, but unfortunately your wife is the accomplice." "Lydia?" the Baron called aghast. "How could you?" The Baroness had long known that she would be convicted. Only a confession would keep her from being hung. Ignoring her husband, she got up and took a few steps towards Holmes and me. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, with her head raised demonstratively, "would you be kind enough to put me and my son in police custody now? I can't stand another minute in these walls and this society." Holmes nodded. "Very well, my lady," he replied, escorting her and Richard Collingwood out, and I followed on the spot. A few days later, Holmes and I were having a cup of tea in Baker Street, studying the newspaper reports on our recent case. The Collingwood scandal caused a sensational uproar, and reports could be read page after page. The head of the family a tyrant, the Baroness a Lady Macbeth, and Sir Richard an unscrupulous fratricide. Socially, the Collingwoods were at an end. "Now the family has suffered a fate that makes one think of a curse," I claimed. Holmes, who clearly did not care about curses and superstition, replied, "It might look like this for simple minds," he replied, "but in truth it was the thought of having power, the urge for validity, greed and jealousy at the individuals that led to these events, and to the collective doom. The soulless nullity of its existence is the true curse of the gentry." "Maybe," I replied, unmoved, "but my pity is limited. John Collingwood will regenerate and get to better health on Capri for the next 4 weeks. Nevertheless, one day he will have to take on the burden of the family history," said Holmes. Then it is probably only George who escaped the curse, I said, by his own decision to break with family and class. How is his youngest protégé, actually? Asked Holmes, suddenly seriously interested. I had to smile. Don't worry, Holmes, I replied. The cobra recovered well from your blow with the hammer. It is already a real attraction in the reptile house of the London Zoo. After all, not every zoo has a convicted murderer to offer.